Huntsville to Mobile. This is Alabama Public Television. WBIQ, Channel 10.
The American Revolution marked the end of British rule in Alabama, or at least in what we now know as Alabama. In the late 1700s, Alabama was not yet a state, but simply a territory with different borders than those that are familiar to us now. Before the British came to Alabama, the Spanish dominated the southern part of the state. After the British left, the Spanish returned.
North of where Mount Vernon is today was U.S. territory. South of that point was Spanish territory. Yet, as sometimes happens, borders fell into dispute. St. Stephen's was, at this time, a valuable fort. Located near Mount Vernon, it was right on the border of U.S. and Spanish territory, and it was claimed by both countries. Fortunately, the dispute was settled by surveyors rather than war, and the land was verified as belonging to the United States. The line that was drawn to define United States and Spanish territorial boundaries was called Ellicott's Line. During this time, more and more pioneers were moving into the territory that was to become Alabama. There were no real roads, but Indian trails and rivers, some possibly traveled 200 years before by De Soto, and then later by the early traders. Those who came by river often traveled on rafts, made by cutting limbs off the trees along the riverbanks and tying them together with vines or rawhide lashings. Those who traveled overland, as well as by river, faced a poorly marked wilderness. A few had crude maps showing major waterways and trails. Some followed notches cut into the trunks of trees by those who had gone before them, and others made their own notches for those who would follow them. One of these notch trails was called the Three-Notch Road, and it went almost all the way across the state, from Columbus, Georgia, to the present site of Montgomery, and along the Alabama River to St. Stephen's. Another trail, the Natchez Trace, cut across the northwest corner of the state. When people reached their destinations, they had to think about building homes and furnishing them. Sometimes they built their own furnishings. Sometimes they brought household items on pack horses or floated them down the river on rafts. Let's visit a historian from Samford University, and let's hear what he has to say about early folk architecture.
Sometimes there are things from the past all around you, but they're so common you never really look at them. Some of these things tell you a surprising amount about your past and what your ancestors were like. One of these is houses. Our great-great-grandparents were closer to the land than we are, and they used natural materials when they built. They shaped fieldstone for chimneys. They cut slate, or more likely split oak for shingles for a roof. But most important, they brought with them ideas from their old homes in Europe or Africa. For example, English settlers brought three kinds of houses to the tidewater of Virginia and the Carolinas. They had first a simple one-room cabin, like this old Alabama cabin. It had perhaps a porch, maybe a shed addition on the back. A nicer one, a second type, was called a hall and parlor house. It had a room on either side of a central hallway. The third kind of house was a really big and fancy house called a Georgian house. It had at least 4 and more likely 8 rooms. When the pioneer migration westward began, up into and around the Appalachians, the cabin again had a chimney built into one side of the cabin. had perhaps a porch and maybe a shed or two out back. This was the original pioneer log structure. The problem came when the pioneer outgrew a one-room log cabin and had to go to 2 rooms. The real problem with a log cabin is it's very difficult to add to. The corners are already made of cross timbers, and it's hard to tie any other structure into these corners. And so what the pioneers did, with characteristic ingenuity, they would build a completely separate cabin and move it close to the first and somehow cover up the gap between. One kind of double-room cabin they built a little bit north of here was called the saddlebag cabin. They built another cabin next to the chimney. You can tell a saddlebag cabin because of a large central chimney and then 2 separate rooms. They would cover this gap here and make a closet here or a storage room here. One of these was called a cat and dog room in one house, and the main living quarters were 2 separate houses. But in our part of the country, a much more common solution was to add on to the other side of the house. They would put the second cabin on this side, build a separate chimney on this end, so they had a working chimney on each end of the house, and in the middle of the house there was a gap called sometimes a breezeway, sometimes a dog trot, and this became the famous dog trot cabin. Later, of course, they built, instead of simply adding an addition, they built the cabin as a whole. But this is the origin of the dog trot cabin. Here's what a dog trot cabin looked like from the side. As a farmer got a bigger family and more income, he could enlarge his dog trot to perhaps a story and a half and add an addition on the back. This is an L addition that contained a kitchen and perhaps a well. As he got more prosperous, he could tack on a nice front porch like this, put a goose in the front yard. He could make his cabin out of sawn timber and even build in a front porch, put on fancy new tin roofing, and eventually he could make his dog trot a 2-story dog trot with columns, false gable, a very fancy house like this that looks much like the original Georgian house. In this part of the country, there are other housing ideas too that have been imported. This housing idea came from the west, from around New Orleans. This is called a shotgun house. The door is in the gable end instead of the eave side of the house. They're called a shotgun house because they had several rooms in a row. And the theory was you could shoot a shotgun in the front door and the shotgun blast would come out the back door and never touch anything. The shotgun house is probably African in origin, coming to this country by way of the West Indies and then New Orleans, spreading up the rivers and the lowlands. It became very popular at a later date, after the pioneer era, as an industrial row house. This is another shotgun house. It shows a high degree of classical influence, Greek style on the front. Another idea that seems to have come to most of the South from New Orleans is the large front porch. There's a lot of history around you as you drive down the road, contained in the ordinary house. Here's a map that shows some of the major cultural areas from the early days of America. In the south, you see New Orleans. It probably should include Mobile, where there was lots of Spanish and French influence and a very old settlement. Going northward up the coast, there is an area around Charleston, based mainly in South Carolina, in green, that has a distinct flavor as a cultural area. Just above that is the Tidewater of Virginia and North Carolina, heavily British in settlement. In orange is a so-called Pennsylvania Dutch settlement. That's primarily German. And the highest one, the furthest one in the north, is the distinctive New England area. The second map shows you how ideas as well as people moved inland as the pioneers began to settle America. They crossed the continent and brought many different ideas into Alabama. This works not only for houses, but old songs, kitchen utensils, barns, toys, The past is really all around us.